On the historic day of October 7, 2023, a profound tragedy unfolded in Israel, marking one of its darkest moments since the Holocaust. This devastating day saw a catastrophic Hamas assault that obliterated entire communities, claimed the lives of over 1,400 individuals, and led to the abduction of countless men, women, and children. Yet, beneath the surface of this immense sorrow lies a lesser-known tale, intertwined with deep historical and religious currents. As we delve into the events that precipitated this fateful day, it becomes evident that the attacks were not just acts of aggression, but also acts of defense, in the eyes of some, centered around the sacred grounds of the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount, a site revered in both Judaism and Islam, became a focal point of contention, especially after a significant event nearly a year prior. In September 2022, a pair of red heifers, deemed perfect according to biblical prophecy, were brought from Texas to Israel. These animals, flawless and unblemished, are now being readied for a ritual sacrifice intended to alter the sacred status quo of the Temple Mount. With a special altar constructed and the Temple Institute poised to carry out this sacrifice before the upcoming Passover, tensions are surging. This pivotal act could potentially catalyze the construction of the Third Temple in Jerusalem, an event of monumental religious significance. This introduction not only sets the stage for the tragic events, but also hints at the deep-seated historical and religious motivations that could reshape the future of a region steeped in millennia of history. Before I continue, I would kindly ask you to subscribe to the channel, like this video if you think that the information is valuable, and share this video with your friends because it's very important that people know about what is happening. With that out of the way, let's begin talking about the Third Temple. To understand what is happening, we have to go back to the Old Testament and the ceremony of sacrificing the red heifer. In the book of Numbers chapter 19 we read, "And the Lord spake unto Moses and unto Aaron, saying, This is the ordinance of the law which the Lord hath commanded, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, that they bring thee a red heifer without spot, wherein is no blemish, and upon which never came yoke. And ye shall give her unto Eleazar the priest, that he may bring her forth without the camp, and one shall slay her before his face. And Eleazar the priest shall take of her blood with his finger and sprinkle of her blood directly before the tabernacle of the congregation 7 times. And one shall burn the heifer in his sight, her skin and her flesh, and her blood. With her dung shall he burn. And the priest shall take cedar wood and hyssop and scarlet, and cast it into the midst of the burning of the heifer. And for an unclean person they shall take of the ashes of the burnt heifer of purification for sin, and running water shall be put thereto in a vessel. And a clean person shall take hyssop and dip it in the water, and sprinkle it upon the tent, and upon all the vessels, and upon the persons that were there, and upon him that touched a bone, or one slain, or one dead, or a grave." According to the rabbi and philosopher Maimonides, 9 red heifers have been sacrificed since the time of Moses. The last time such a ceremony took place was just before the Second Temple was destroyed by the Romans on the Mount of Olives opposite to the Temple Mount. According to Maimonides, when the 10th red heifer will be sacrificed, we will enter a messianic age. Now, you may not take it seriously what I'm saying, but the Temple Institute is actively preparing for this monumental event on the Mount of Olives. And there is a reason why the Temple Institute wants to perform the sacrifice of the red heifer on the Mount of Olives. You see, during the Second Temple times, the red heifers had to be sacrificed away from the temple. The Kidron Valley that separated the Temple Mount from the Mount of Olives provided a sufficient buffer zone between the clean and unclean. Now, what is very important to understand is that the ashes of the red heifer mixed with the pure water were used to clean the priests, the temple, and the temple instruments. Of course, today, on the spot where the temple was located, we have the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And this is a big problem for the Jewish people today, because you can enter the Temple Mount, but you are not ceremonially clean, and you must be careful where you step, because the territory of the Temple Mount is the most holy place for the Jewish people, and there were some parts of the Temple Mount that only the high priest could enter. And this is why the ashes of the red heifer are so crucial in the development, in the building of the next temple. And once the ashes of the red heifer are used to cleanse the Temple Mount, the construction of the temple will begin. I mean, this is some serious stuff we are talking about. And as we look at the topography of Jerusalem, we can see that the Mount of Olives is higher than the Temple Mount. And so the priest that would be performing a sacrifice on the Mount of Olives would see the court of the temple. And the Temple Institute already has a spot selected on the Mount of Olives, where the sacrifice of the red heifer before this year's Passover will take place. So it looks like this Passover will be something very different from what we have known in the past. And the tension is growing as the Temple Institute said that it is very probable that this Passover, the red heifer sacrifice, may happen. And we shouldn't be surprised that, at this moment when this is all happening, when all the pieces come together, the tensions between the Arab people and the Jewish people are ultra high. Guys, we are living in incredible times, something that many generations could not witness. We are seeing the resurrection of the nation of Israel, where God gathered the Jewish people from all over the earth. And now there are only the final chapters of the scripture that need to be fulfilled. We saw the birth pains of Israel, but after the pain comes great joy and relief. Today, building the third temple seems possible, but it wasn't always like this. Meet Mr. Yehuda Glick, today a very influential person on the Jewish presence on the Temple Mount. Glick quickly became controversial and popular for his advocacy for Jewish rights to the Temple Mount. Each year, Glick was bringing more and more Jewish people to the Temple Mount. His popularity and activity disturbed the Arab population that just hated the man. And then on October 29, 2014, as Glick was giving a speech at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, he was shot by a Palestinian. Glick survived the attack and was rescued by the Israeli medics. And he only continued his mission. Since then, his influence only grew, and in 2016, he joined the Knesset for the Likud party. Being part of the ruling body in Israel, Glick has elevated the issue of the Jewish temple to another level. Since 2016, Glick was able to receive support for his cause from prominent Jewish leaders. Here you will be able to hear an interview where Glick talks about the progress of this issue in Israel. Fringe, zealots, lunatics, peculiar. Today it's mainstream. One of those members is Yehuda Glick. 10 years ago, there was not a single member of Knesset who ascended the Temple Mount. Today we have 20 of the Knesset members who are interested in ascending the Temple Mount, praying on the Temple Mount, and are part in the battle for the redemption of the Temple Mount, and for bringing the Temple Mount back into the center of the next step in the redemption process. And what is this next step in the redemption process? It's the sacrifice of the red heifer on the Mount of Olives. This will open the gates to the Temple Mount for the Jewish people, and then the temple can be built. The Temple Institute is actively preparing for this very moment. They are training the future priests that will serve in the future temple. The priests are already performing sacrifices every year and training for the very important sacrifice that may happen this Passover. They also have all the equipment needed to serve in the temple ready. How far are we from building the temple? Well, if you go to the website thirdtemple.org, you will see that there are actual plans of building this temple. This organization called the Third Temple has already architects that created the plans for building the Third Temple in Jerusalem. The purpose of this temple would be to facilitate all religions of the world in this one place in Jerusalem. So an universal religion that would gather all people. This new structure, according to what they say on the website, would facilitate global peace in the world, and the whole world would be redeemed by this new structure. Of course, the reality we see today is quite different. There is a coalition growing against Israel. The United Nations are constantly criticizing Israel for her operation in Gaza. Even Russia is now against Israel, as Israel announced that it will help Ukraine in their defense against Russia. So are we getting closer to the final conflict, the so-called Armageddon? Well, I can tell you that we have never been closer. But the good news is that at the end of this road, there will be true redemption of the world. This is our hope. Faith, in many aspects of life, acts as a guiding light in darkness and a spiritual anchor when facing challenges and uncertainties. It is not just a belief in a spiritual entity or religion, but also a belief in oneself, in the strength of the community, and in a better future. Faith provides the strength to overcome adversities, helping us find meaning and purpose in life. It is a solid foundation for courageous actions and sacrifices where we seek not only our own salvation but also that of those around us. In the toughest of times, faith challenges us not to give up, evoking compassion and patience and igniting the flame of hope, even when all seems lost. Of all of the women in recent history, no one has captured the public imagination like Teresa of Calcutta. Mother Teresa, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, is regarded by many as a living saint. They had come in their thousands to see her. She touched the lives of millions of people throughout the world. Who could have foreseen when Angeze Gongshe Boyakshu was born in what is now Skopje, North Macedonia, in August 1910, that she would become one of the icons of the 20th century, recognized across the globe as Mother Teresa, saintly giver of comfort to the destitute. More specifically, who could have predicted that she would embody so much of what was wrong with that century and the next? This video sets to expose shocking revelations by Mother Teresa, finding the good to be fragile and the bad profound. One of Mother Teresa's deepest fears after she founded the Missionaries of Charity was that she or one of her sisters and brothers would do or say something to cause scandal or detract from the order's mission. She could be quite brutal. I have heard her shout and scream at the other sisters. Likely, this explains, at least in part, her reluctance to speak publicly of the interior locution she had experienced for 7 or 8 months after the call within a call came on the train to Darjeeling. So there was this Mother Teresa outside the Missionaries of Charity, little old woman, everyone is, oh, you know how sweet, but inside it was very different. Yet Teresa did cause scandal, although only after she'd been dead for a decade, and then only for a short time. In 2007, a book that collected many of her most personal and private correspondence was published. It immediately caused sorrow and confusion in her admirers, and a glee that bordered on taking pleasure in another's misfortune in her detractors. Her letters revealed that, except for one short period, Teresa had been afflicted with a deep sense of God's absence for the last half-century of her life. Such was her unflagging dedication to the work she'd undertaken for God, that most of the world was completely unsuspecting of her spiritual darkness. Even Teresa's closest companions in the Missionaries of Charity were shocked. Never had she made any reference to the darkness, except for reference that would have meant nothing to anyone but her confessors with whom she shared what she was going through. 4 years before she died, she warned her sisters that the devil is continuously on the prowl to make you feel it is impossible that Jesus really loves you, is really cleaving to you. This is a danger for all of us. None of them could have guessed that the remark was autobiographical. For their part, Teresa's detractors pointed to the revelations in the book as evidence that Teresa was a faux saint whose public displays of piety were hypocritical. Longtime critic Christopher Hitchens declared that the letters revealed Teresa to be a confused old lady who had ceased to believe and whose service to others was nothing more than part of an effort, still the misery within. Alongside Tariq Ali, Christopher Hitchens had extended this declaration by producing a highly critical British channel for documentary, Hell's Angel, based on Chatterjee's work. All over this unhappy globe, there are heroic volunteers putting up a selfless battle on behalf of the wretched of the earth. But only one of these is considered to have invisible means of support, to be nothing less than a saint. What makes Teresa of Calcutta so divine? In 2012, William Doino Jr., a Catholic freelancer journalist working for Inside the Vatican and First Things, wrote that the remarkable thing about Hell's Angel is that it purports to defend the poor against Mother Teresa's supposed exploitation of them, while never actually interviewing any on-screen. Not a single person cared for by the missionary speaks on camera. Was this because they had a far higher opinion of Blair's Blessed Teresa than Hitchens would permit in his film? It's like you're actually seeing a living saint. However, Mary Loudon, a writer and former volunteer at the Home for the Dying, was interviewed saying that the place reminded her of photos she had seen of World War I facilities. There were basic costs, but no chairs, no garden, and no yard. The dying patients were not being given any medication other than aspirin and the like. And not a single person was given any medication other than aspirin and the like. They're not being given painkillers, really, beyond aspirin, and maybe if you're lucky, some Brufen or something. She also relayed a story about how drip needles were not sterilized between uses because the nuns saw no benefit to it, and a story about how a sick but treatable 15-year-old boy should have been sent to the local hospital for help, but the nuns refused. Furthermore, this report had been substantiated by a 1994 study by the UK-based. The Lancet Medical Journal had already reported that even the most basic life-saving drugs were not administered to salvageable patients who should have been admitted to a hospital rather than Mother Teresa's famous home for the dying. Hitchen also argued that the Catholic Church's interpretation of Teresa's time in the desert as a dark night of the soul was a perverse piece of marketing that sought to spin despair as faith. There's no sense in denying that Mother Teresa's sojourn in the wilderness is disconcerting. If God can seem absent to a saint like her, what chance do the rest of us have to connect with God? It's also quite probably true, given the nature of her work among the poorest of the poor, that at times Teresa felt psychologically depressed or burnt out. What normal person wouldn't? But to conclude that the darkness was the result of depression, much less loss of faith, is to overlook its spiritual significance. Psychological depression is me-centered. The depressive's gaze is always directed inward. Teresa's, on the other hand, was directed outward, to the God whose absence she so keenly felt. Depression renders a sufferer listless. Mother Teresa was always on the go, doing the work to which she felt God had called her. Moreover, dark periods don't necessarily suggest a loss of faith. Instead, they are recognized in the Christian tradition as periods of great spiritual development. But what feels like abandonment is far from it. The painful sense of being rejected by God is actually a purgation of the senses and spirit that prepares the way for an inflow of God into the soul. There is no set time limit for a dark night of the soul, although most do not last as long as Mother Teresa's did. Nor does the dark night mean that the sufferer has ceased to believe in God, although intense doubts can arise. In one of her letters, Mother Teresa writes, "In my soul, I feel just that terrible pain of loss, of God not wanting me, of God not being God, of God not really existing. But the occasional dreadful thought that God may be a fiction wasn't her primary torment." Mother Teresa's suffering when God hid from her was intense. From first to last, her private correspondence to her confessors attests to that. Just a few passages, representative of the whole, convey something of the loneliness into which her sense of God's absence drove her. What especially bewildered and saddened her was that the darkness had descended in 1949, right when she believed she was doing precisely the work God had created her to do. Her loss of the presence of God coincided with the granting of the long-sought permission to find the order that became the Missionaries of Charity. Surely the Vatican's approval was a sign from God that He loved her and wanted her to succeed. But it was just at that point that she felt the door slam shut. God disappeared. There was to be but one time the door opened in her many years of darkness. Pius III was the pontiff who gave permission to find her order. When he died in October 1958, Archbishop Perrier celebrated a Requiem Mass in the Calcutta Cathedral. Teresa attended and on that same day received a respite from her forlornness. As she wrote Perrier, "I prayed for a proof that God is pleased with a society. There and then disappeared that long darkness, that pain of loss, of loneliness, of that strange suffering of 10 years. Today, my soul is filled with love." But in just a short time, God thought it better for me to be in the tunnel. So He is gone again. Teresa would endure the tunnel for the next 4 decades. As the years of darkness came and went, Mother Teresa slowly began to see them as something different from the dark night of the soul described by John of the Cross and experienced by Thérèse de Lisieux. It was, she concluded, an essential part of her vocation as a missionary of charity. Even as a teenager back in Skopje, Teresa had longed to serve the poor. When she became a missionary nun, she spent her Sundays roaming the slums around the Loreto compound, bringing relief to the poor. When she received the call within a call, she dedicated the rest of her life to giving the poor, the sick, the lonely, and the dying the love that the world had denied them. Moreover, she voluntarily took on their poverty as her own. Teresa dedicated her life to this work because she believed that Christ demanded it of her. As she so often said, when she succored the poor and the sick, she ministered to Christ in his distressing disguise, the Christ who thirsted. So it was perhaps inevitable, given that she shared in the suffering of the people she served, that Teresa would eventually discern her own inner poverty as a share in the suffering of Christ himself. She remembered the oath she'd made back in 1942, never to deny God anything asked of her, and she realized that loyalty to the oath meant embracing God's withdrawal. We must know exactly when we say yes to God what is in that yes. Yes means I surrender, totally, fully, without any counting the cost. It meant accepting whatever God gave and giving whatever God chose to take away. And for Teresa, it meant accepting the burden of Christ's passion. When she was allowed that insight into the nature of her darkness, she recognized it as an inevitable aspect of the call within a call, and would go so far as to say that she actually loved the darkness because it was a very, very small part, of Jesus' darkness and pain on earth. Teresa's final years were ones in which poor health and physical suffering became her daily burden. Just a few months before her death, suffering from heart failure and pneumonia, she lay in a hospital bed, unable to speak because of the bronchial tube that had been inserted to help her breathe. She tried to communicate with her caretakers by writing on slips of paper, but was too weak to do so. Finally, mustering all her strength, she was able to scrawl, "I want Jesus." Mass was celebrated in her hospital room, and she was able to take a small amount of the consecrated wine, but given her decades of living without a sense of Christ's presence, it's not too much to conclude that she also meant she wanted the darkness of God's withdrawal to end. She'd spent over 50 years reliving Christ's passion. If it was God's will that she suffers, so be it. But she longed for it to end. In the second decade of her sense of abandonment, Teresa wrote something that anticipated her later understanding of her vocation to suffer the passion of Christ. "If I ever become a saint, I will surely be one of darkness. I will continually be absent from heaven to light the light of those in darkness on earth." Thank you so much for your attention. I hope you were able to learn something new in this episode. I hope it was helpful for you. Please remember to subscribe to the channel, give a like to this video, share it with your friends, because it's important that they know. I want to thank everybody who is supporting this channel. You have been a great help to me, and thanks to you I can continue my work